It's a pleasure to see so many of you here in the audience tonight. I'm Josephine Hendin, Professor of English and Italian American Studies here at NYU. And it's not only a pleasure, but also an honor to welcome you to the Casa Italiana Zerilli-marimò tonight to celebrate the life and writing of Louise DeSalvo, one of the most gifted and productive Italian-American women writers of our time. Her groundbreaking work as a memoirist and scholar of Virginia Woolf established her as a unique woman of letters and a brilliant innovator in extending the memoir into new dimensions as a literary form. Tonight, we have a chance to applaud and celebrate the riches of Louise DeSalvo as a writer in a very tangible form. So let me give 3 cheers for the emergence of the paperback edition of Personal Effects. Co-edited by Edvige Giunta and Nancy Caronia. And a casebook of Louise DeSalvo's work. So I want to express my thanks to each of you on the panel for the brilliance, originality, and insight you brought to the work of this extraordinary woman. Each of you brought a different perspective on Louise DeSalvo's many gifts. Each of you enabled us to understand her driving spirit and innovative flair as a writer and her complete commitment to opening up the mysteries of our connections to each other. Many of us here tonight have also experienced Louise's generosity of spirit as a teacher and friend. But I'm particularly honored to have Jason DeSalvo, her son, here tonight, who knew Louise, of course, as none of the rest of us could. There is an abundance of talent in the room tonight, and so without further delay, I will turn our celebration of the revelations that come from reading Louise DeSalvo's work to one of her closest friends and most insightful commentators, Edvige Giunta, who will introduce the panelists and conduct the discussion of personal effects. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo, and thank you to Casa Italiana for hosting this event. I imagine many of you have seen the most recent adaptation of Little Women, and even if you haven't, many of you have, particularly women, have read Little Women. I know many of us loved Jo. Writers and the characters they create occupy such an intimate space in our lives. Sometimes they are sources of comfort, even salvation. Many children who grow to become writers have found salvation in the encounter with authors through their books. And so that definitely was the case with Louise, who writes about those trips to the library in Vertigo. And most of these writers, for most of us, are writers who have been dead hundreds of years, and still we think of them as literary friends. And they're part of our circle of friends. But what happens when the writer that you admire, that you love, whose books inspire you, that you keep on your night table, on your desk, you have a designated bookshelf? They are people you meet in the flesh and you speak to and grow to love them and have a deep connection with them. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And how does it feed your life and work? So I was thinking of chickpea soup with spinach and lemon from a cookbook that Louise told me to buy, and I dutifully did. And biscotti that she would bake, eaten at her kitchen table, which is now in my sister's house, and that's a complicated story. While we were editing The Milk of Almonds, pasta with broccoli and pistachios, the scarf that she knitted for me, the shawl that she knitted and used to wear. Louise DeSalvo was a writer. I cannot just say that I admired her. I think she helped me shape myself as a writer, a teacher, an intellectual, the way in which I view myself as living in the world of letters. But she was also my beloved friend. And those two dimensions of our relationship were in continuous interaction, so much so that at some point we decided that we could not talk about work all the time. And so this was Louise's idea. We designated the time, was Monday morning around 3:45, where we would have our work talk. And then for the rest of the week, no work talk. And that worked insofar that on Monday afternoon we would have our work talk. But we continued to talk about writing, the writing that we produced and the writing that we read, and the students that we taught every day, between talk of laundry and cooking and children and husbands and friends, and the struggles we endured, the achievements that we had, the joys, the sorrows. Louise DeSalvo taught me what a literary friendship is in the most profound, influential, lasting sense of the word. Sometimes I will tell my husband, I wish I could call Louise when I am in a difficult situation, or just to know an answer to some question. It may be a question that has to do on how to end a particular essay, or how to deal with a difficult student or a difficult colleague. And my husband tells me, well, what would Louise say? And so I do spend time having these silent conversations with my good friend Louise. And I think tonight is an evening that it's about literary friendship. Not only because for so many of us who are here today, not just in our panel, but also in the audience, that work and friendship have overlapped in so many different ways. Because Louise DeSalvo was a writer who touched you in ways that transcended what a book often does for a reader. There was a way in which her work was so honest and visceral and generous that it saved lives. And when I say that it saved lives, I don't say that lightly. I really mean it, and I've seen that happen again and again for many, many people. So in the last 16 months since Louise's death, we have had a number of gatherings. Some have been physical gatherings in spaces where we come together to talk about our work. And others have occurred in literary journals. There have been several special issues of a number of journals devoted to Louise's work. Certainly a question that's been on my mind and on the mind of those of us who have read Louise, loved Louise, and written about Louise is the question of the legacy and the connection between paying tribute, but also creating a conversation that gains strength from the paying tribute as a way to propel forward something that is not just a celebration of the work, but the continuity of the work. And so it's to be here tonight is with my friends here and in this space where I've been so many times is especially meaningful, also because of all the events that I organized between the late 1990s and the early 2000s at Casa Italiana, where Stefano Albertini was this incredibly generous, giving figure who opened the doors of this place to Italian-American women and really was incredibly important for us. The very first was the presentation of a book by Louise, and so Louise was here, and so I kind of want to evoke her presence in multiple ways. But we're also here to celebrate the publication of the paperback edition of this book that Nancy Caronia and I edited, and the Fordham University Press published. Fordham University Press is also the publisher that published the last two books of Louise, which we have upstairs. And so there are all these different things that are coming together. And then Justin DeSalvo and his wife, Lynn, are here, which is incredibly important and moving, and not just for me. And I asked Jason if he would sit here, even though he has not written an essay for this book, but he's done much more important work in the Louise DeSalvo field. And the way in which the event is going to unfold, each of our presenters will talk a little bit about their relationship, their connection with Louise. And after that, maybe I might ask a question. But then we would like to hear from the audience, and you can pose questions or just share your experience of having known Louise, whether through her books or having met her personally, having been perhaps her student. So I'm going to ask Jason to get us started. And let's just welcome Jason DeSalvo.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you to NYU. Thank you to the Fordham University Press, and thank you everyone for coming. The last time I was at NYU related to something for my mom was her graduation. I was young. It was in Washington Square Park, and it went on forever. That's my memory. She was very proud of being an alumnus here, and you know, as her son, I guess I have a different role to fill tonight. My goal is very simply to share with you a little bit of who she was as a human, as mom. And she really was all that. You're not going to hear any dirt. You're not going to hear, she was an incredible human being, and one that most of us in our family kind of scratch our heads every day and say how lucky we were. So, by the way, is it ridiculously gorgeous out tonight? As I walked up the street, I learned poetry I studied poetry at the New School. There's a restaurant, Gotham Bar and Grill, just down the street that Mom and Dad used to like to take me and Deb to when we had absolutely no money. And so it was kind of memory lane just walking up and down this very block. So most of you probably know my mom as a scholar, writer, educator, and her accomplishments in these areas are certainly worthy of both remembering and celebrating, and we'll do much of that tonight. But I'd like to simply speak more about Louise's mom and give you a little insight into who she was in that role. We've always been a very small, incredibly close family. Unlike the case when many modern families want to move away from each other, we actually kind of begged my mom and dad to move to Montclair so that she could be, and they could be closer to us, so that we could be part of their lives, they could be part of our lives, and they could enjoy the joy of watching their grandchildren grow up, Stephen and Julia. And for over 15 years, I've lived less than 3 miles from my parents' house. Now it's just Dad, but obviously it was Mom and Dad. And we saw each other multiple times a week. And I've made it a point to call my mom and dad every morning, which may sound kind of homeboy-like, but that's just how I am. Not because I ever felt obligated to, but because I love to. I love talking to them. And because my dad and I work together, we share a business that we work together. My brother, my dad, and me co-founded a business, right? So we see each other, and my dad and I see each other more regularly. So a lot of the times, those calls would be me and my mom catching up. And I always loved and appreciated her endless curiosity and excitement in hearing news about how Deborah, Stephen, Julia, and I were doing. No level of detail was too small for her to take interest in, as you can tell by the way she writes memoir, right? What book was Deb reading? Is she enjoying it? How was Stephen liking college? Does he have a girlfriend? Was Julia's skating competition a success? Did that asshole parent who heckles the kids behave herself this time? And yes, Louise DeSalvo, my mom, would definitely have used the word asshole. I love when Mom would share with me in minute detail the pasta that she and my dad had made together the night before for dinner, or hearing about the glorious evening swim that they took in their pool as twilight turned to darkness and the crickets began their nightly chorus. I loved hearing about the trips that my parents planned to take, including a trip to Italy with their friend Charles and Michelle to eat at all of the best pizza places in Naples. My dad's in Naples now eating pizza, by the way. At least he did earlier tonight, so he sends his regards and regrets, but that's where he was. And it better have been serving proper Neapolitan-style pizza, and she would have a pizza margherita, and they better not have put any Parmesan cheese on it, because that's not appropriate. And then upon their return, I would relish hearing an impassioned and minutely detailed review of which was best and why. Sometimes my mom would tell me about a new route she found to drive to a place that she regularly had to go that would invariably take twice as long, but be worth the extra time simply because it was more beautiful. And I would relish calling her to let her know that if she altered her usual walking route around town in such a way she could be able to walk by and smell the most divine bloom of roses. I learned to take the time necessary to enjoy beauty from my mom. And that's a gift. I often had to stifle a giggle when Mom would not have eaten breakfast yet and already be actively engaging me in a conversation about what we'd be eating for lunch or maybe even dinner. Who should cook what? Where should we shop? How the strip steaks at Rosario's, her favorite local butcher, were not only worth the price but would be perfect for grilling this evening. I vividly remember during the time that Mom was writing Chasing Ghosts, that's a book that you can actually get a copy of upstairs, her memoir that deals with World War II and its effect on the relationship with her father. Many of our morning conversations revolved around what she was learning about war. Jay, can you believe that Britain had lost over 2 million gross tons of merchant shipping before 1940? Jay, did you know that where your grandfather was stationed in the Admiralty Islands is very close to where you went scuba diving in Palau? I wonder if any of the shipwrecks that you dove on there were shot down by planes that your grandfather helped keep airborne. 60% of the 1.75 million troops lost by the Japanese during the war died of malnutrition and disease rather than being lost in battle. I'm pretty certain that Mom did more research about World War II than many historians who specialize in World War II. And she did this for Memoir. You see, when Louise DeSalvo endeavored to do something, be it researching a subject for a book, helping a grandkid think through college choices, planning a menu for a meal, or knitting a sweater, like this one, she was always what you would call all in. It was one of her most defining, endearing, and yes, sometimes maddening traits. One morning, our morning phone calls were certainly not only initiated by me. I always love when the phone rings and I see my parents' number come up on the caller ID. It makes me feel warm inside. It reinforces the special bond we've had as a family, our incredible friendship. So when several years ago, well after my mom had gotten her cancer diagnosis that we all knew but never openly admitted was terminal, you can imagine my panic when she called and said, "Jason, are you sitting down? Because I have some news to share with you that's truly life-changing." My heart sank, and while I swallowed hard and prepared for the worst, I must admit to being somewhat baffled by just how upbeat she sounded, notwithstanding the bombshell that I assumed was coming. Go to your computer right now and Google ROCCBOX. Still struggling to follow and not quite remembering exactly what it was that she spelled out, I was certain that she must have started or shared with me the name of some exotic multisyllabic cancer drug or treatment. Mom, could you please repeat that? What is the name of the drug I'm searching for? Now, my mom sounded annoyed. I'm sure you guys have heard this. Like she did when people wasted her time with something trivial. Drug? I didn't mention the name of a drug. I said go and Google Rockbox. It's a pizza oven. It's exactly the product that we always hoped someone would build. A reasonably priced, portable, gas-fired pizza oven that can cook Neapolitan-style pizzas at 900 degrees. You've got to see this thing. It's absolutely adorable. And the company making them is crowdfunding a startup. It's a crowdfunding startup over in England. I just ordered mine. You have to go online this second and do the same. I got mine in the lime green color. They also offer gray. That's probably more your style. They should be shipping the first batch in less than 3 months, right? This is while she's suffering with serious terminal cancer. So it's not that my mom didn't take having cancer seriously. It's just that she had this amazing ability to put it in its box and not let it dominate her life any more than was absolutely necessary. Kind of the way when you were in the room with her, you were the only person there. She had this ability to just be so in that moment. Whether it was the sweater she was knitting, a conversation she had with my dad that morning, hearing from Julia, watching Stephen cook a meal, Debo's laughter, the lunch that she had with Justin and Lynn the day before, these things were all front and center to her and were never allowed to be drowned out or diminished by her illness. Good morning, sweetheart. How's everyone in your house? That's usually the way Mom would begin her calls with me. I'm great. I just got back from a bike ride, and Deb and the kids are still sleeping. How are you? Sometimes Mom wasn't able to avoid talking about cancer, but even the way she did that was uniquely her. I'm having a rough day. Yesterday, Dad and I got my most recent PET scan results, and my cancer's spreading. The drugs that I've been on don't seem to be working anymore. Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. What can you do? There are other drugs to try and lots of other treatment options. We'll figure something out. I also had a long talk with my cancer after I got the news. You did what? Well, I explained to them that I'm okay with them living in my body, but that we really do need to set some boundaries and figure out how to share. I told them that if they got greedy and grew too much, that they'll kill us both, and that just doesn't seem to make sense to anyone, right? Before I could figure out whether to laugh or cry, my mom had moved on. Dad told me that we're getting together at your place for dinner tonight and that Debo made pizza dough yesterday. Did she use Leahy's recipe? There's going to be 9 of us, so should we bring our rock box over too? That way we can fire 2 pizzas at the same time. Have you guys started thinking about what kind of pizzas you want to make? Dad and I would love at least one of them to be a traditional margherita with no Parmesan cheese. In my favorite of my mother's books, Crazy in the Kitchen, there's a touching scene in the last chapter where she imagines reconciling with her mother. And they had a very kind of troubled relationship. It opens with the line, "Imagine that we're together." Yes, Mom. Every morning, as long as I continue to breathe, I'll do just that. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Bernard, and I'm the wife of John Gennari. But as I start my reflections about Louise, I knew Louise first, and I knew Louise through her work. I remember, the first conference I came to, and I had read all of her books at that point, and I brought my books, and she wrote me an email in 2003, and we started a relationship really through email and through our work. And she was the most perfect model I've ever had as a writer. At that point, I was struggling about making a transition from being an academic to being a creative writer. And Louise's work, I will never forget it. You know, it just, the way she wrote about Virginia Woolf was so personal and so beautiful. But then there was another model of just Louise's work ethic. I'm still trying to, get close to approximating. I should get it out. It's sort of a fantasy. But it was something about the precision of her work, but also the wildness of her imagination that, I'm still aspiring to emulate. But that's what I guess I have to say about her. She was so welcoming to me. I came to meet her and had all of her books, and that was so early in my own writing life, And as someone who received a fan, she was so generous. And we started an email relationship, I was just, someone who was just besotted with her imagination. And I remember, I read Adultery first, and it made me believe in marriage. It really, again, the intensity of her engagement with every single idea made me feel that I could be married and that I could be still engaged with the world in a creative way. So her freedom, her honesty, her intensity, her unapologetic posture toward her work, and I think an understanding about not only forging her own way, but forging a way for generations of writers to follow her. It made a huge impression on me, and she was precious to me. So I guess that's true of everyone here. I will say that, with the passing of Louise, not so far after the passing of Toni Morrison, thinking about what it means to leave these lions for us to survive the literary lions in our lives, and a deepened obligation to maintain a legacy. And what Louise did for me was to reach back to a writer who was trying to form her own sense of self, and she held me, and she made a space for me that lasted, And I just wish that we never got together on our own. We saw each other at conferences and at our beloved Eddie's house, and I just wish I had tried harder, to I wish I just delivered myself to her doorstep, because, what I benefited from was virtual in terms of our digital relationship, but also her work. And it's all I have to offer today. That's just how she modeled so much for me. She was so generous with her advice and her love. The word love, I feel, I enjoyed part of that too. Simply a writer who was trying to follow in her footsteps. So that's what I want to leave today. I've since in my life met many other literary heroes, but Louise was so generous. I'll never forget it. Bringing all of her books and her stopping to sign each one personally, and to always, may I just quote from that email? I don't remember what I wrote to her, but it was obviously very personal. She said, "So wonderful to meet you, clutching all my books on Friday." And she said, "The key is to take marriage very seriously, and not seriously at all. I know that sounds strange, but to remake the institution as if it were your own image." And that's a bravery of Louise that I'm still trying to emulate, and that I want to honor tonight. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mary Jo Bona, and I'm so honored to be here. I want to thank the Casa Italiana, Eddie Giunta, and Nancy Caronia for editing Personal Effects. And I want to say a couple of things about Eddie Giunta. Eddie and I have had a long-term relationship. And she's an interesting woman in many ways. I got an email from her about, 10 years ago, and she said, "Well, we got permission to do this book. Send the article, send the chapter. Can you do it, send it in a couple of months?" And I said, "What chapter, what book? When did I tell you I was going to do this?" She said, remember we were talking at that Biancaria conference about, and you said you had this idea about threads and cloth work. That was like at the floppy disk stage, and I didn't have that computer anymore, and I said, well, I need 6 months. And I ended up getting it finished and realizing that, of course, many other excellent scholars and writers, including your mom, were part of that, and that was the Embroidered Stories book. So knowing that when the invitation from Eddie comes, and now with Nancy, it's going to happen. And now we're celebrating the paperback edition of Personal Effects, and I want to talk about that a little bit today, because I wrote this piece with a co-author, Jennifer Di Gregorio Keitlinger, who couldn't be here today because her daughter broke her ankle. So she's at home and she's sending love, but I want to make sure I honor her as well, because the chapter couldn't have been written the same way without her input and hard work in it. But this is what we did for that chapter, and I was thinking about this based on what Jason said, because we also write about that scene at the end of Crazy in the Kitchen about the mom finally trying to Louise DeSalvo is not nostalgic, right? She refuses nostalgia, right? So she imagines the scene with her mother, but then she recognizes that this is a fantasy, and she's willing to say that. So when Jennifer Keitlinger and I were working on this chapter for Personal Effects, we are not food critics, but we tried to place, how could you not, place Vertigo, her two major memoirs, Vertigo and Crazy in the Kitchen, in the context of food. And this is how we did it, and I'll be very brief about it. First of all, we called it The Fruits of Her Labor, DeSalvo's Memoirs of Food and Family. And we tried to frame the entire chapter by using menu items. So we began with the antipasto as the introduction, and then we had the Il Primo, in which we talked about Vertigo, and then we had a few sort of contornis that we put parenthetically, and it really ended up not being cheesy, really, it worked. It ultimately, we felt like it worked, and I want to read to you our Il Dolce, the end of our article, because it's quite long. But what we tried to argue was this in the chapter, in the Fordham edition, that the loss of the language haunted her whole life, Louise. The loss of Italian, right? The dialect, the language, all of it. So food becomes the vehicle that transports her back to the homeland and her ancestors. And the genre of memoir is very interesting with what she does with this, right? She starts out, we argue, from a kind of feminist confession in Vertigo, and then slowly shifts to what we call a kind of ethnic memoir or literary ethnography in Crazy in the Kitchen. And that allows her to move from a kind of drama of incoherence that she felt as a young girl writing in Vertigo to one of healing that you see in Crazy in the Kitchen. So how does she do this? She attempts to reverse the culinary history bequeathed to her by her family, by a mother who was depressed and suffering. So food became her signifier of the past, right? A palpable, tangible connection to an Italian-American identity that can be ingested, consumed, and known completely. A kind of adopted language practiced in the absence of shared words. And she says this on more than one occasion, Louise, my cooking makes my writing possible. And most of people in this audience and on our panel knows how, excruciating writing can be at times. It's always so good to do something doable, right? Like making a delicious meal. It can be finished within, unless you're Louise DeSalvo and it takes 3 days, but typically within a couple of hours, right, to make something beautiful. So I want to end by reading just the final paragraphs that Jennifer Keitlinger and I wrote together. This is how we move toward the ending of our chapter in Personal Effects on behalf of Vertigo and Crazy in the Kitchen. Armed with an incomplete family history, historical and sociological accounts of Italians and Italians in America, memories of a childhood marked by abuse and neglect, and a desire to recover the sense of wellness she experienced while cooking with her grandmother, DeSalvo attempts to actively negotiate an Italian-American ethnic identity she was deprived of as a child. Traditional ethnic food serves as a thread that helps weave these together. DeSalvo's relationship to her Italian-American ethnicity is mediated through food. She convincingly depicts food as an ethnic and gendered marker at work in migration events, assimilative efforts, and cultural histories. So in Il Dolce, this is how we respond to Louise. The fruits of DeSalvo's labor are bittersweet. This memoirist knows how to sugar the pill. For DeSalvo, the practice of and writing about traditional foodways authorizes a position in the family's lineage. The passing of recipe and ritual down through the generations encourages awareness of self as informed by ancestry. Cooking and food writing also help to create a collective Italian-American culinary experience that may persist in spite of linguistic, geographic, economic, or educational boundary crossing. And yet, cooking and writing caused DeSalvo great pain. Taking hours-long trips to the supermercato, examining labels and considering the quality of each ingredient, obsessing over preparation techniques and cooking tools. DeSalvo reveals a relationship with food that is both celebratory and fraught with contradictions, and a kind of discomfort that stems from the great divide between her grandmother's peasant meals and her own gourmet dishes. These contradictions are what make DeSalvo's work authentic and her memoirs painful and inviting. Our own family relationships to food strikingly parallel and diverge from DeSalvo's memoirs. Yet, for both of us, they are equally agrodolce, bittersweet. Our own admixture of food memories was inspired by Louise's memoirs, and I will recall them briefly in conclusion. Mary Jo, that's me, Mary Jo's mother taught her daughter the joys of cooking. Together they would howl with laughter at their kitchen mistakes, dropping the tub of nonpareils waiting to be sprinkled on the pupaglova. But it was Mary Jo's paternal grandmother who haunted her dreams with the story of the basket of holes she would surely receive in purgatory after all the food she wasted as a child. Bittersweet, Jennifer recalls the escape her grandmother's kitchen provided, a place where the sweet smell of tomato sauce and the pungent odor of cabbage mingled. Irma Linda's kitchen provided a respite from a social world in which she often felt othered. Now, when Jennifer watches her daughter, Emily, her grandmother's namesake, cooking with her own mother in the family's Brooklyn apartment, she wishes that same respite for both her daughters, understanding how quickly that sense of wellness may be compromised by age, illness, exhaustion, and the darkness of one's own mind. DeSalvo admits that darkness into her kitchen. It is an ingredient in all her recipes. The shadows of the past are as integral to her pizza making as the dough itself. Their presence raises the stakes for the chef, the memoirist, and her readers, demanding an interpretation of the food on the plate and the elusive nature of its origins. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'm Peter Covino. I wrote something out, and I'm going to stick to the script because I had a pretty intimate phone relationship and personal relationship with Louise, and I just don't want to say anything on tape that I probably shouldn't be saying. So this is called Getting It Right. In her brilliant The House of Early Sorrows, released in 2018, which then won the 2019 American Book Award, just a few months before Louise's death, I know Louise has changed parts of her riveting essay, My Sister's Suicide, along with some of the other work, most of which I've known in various versions. It's sort of a greatest hits, and this is the book. I just love it. I love how it looks, the texture. I applaud Louise's consistent respect for the writerly editing process. And I know during our conversations that I've heard different versions of personal information she'd written about in her books. Nonetheless, to use a very DeSalvoan word, I'm befuddled by the idea of her messing with this particular essay. I've written at length about the essay, My Sister's Suicide, in Personal Effects as well, which is also a pivotal section of Louise's best-selling memoir, Vertigo, from 1997. My work on this essay has cost me a lot emotionally and psychically because of the subject matter: suicide, death, physical and sexual abuse, and also violence of other kinds. Vertigo is a book I've taught at least a dozen times in a variety of classes, even a poetry workshop, to illustrate and make the argument that Louise is an expert at pacing, at subtle juxtaposition of contradictory material, at cutting to the chase with the exact poetic cadence, while also eschewing the use of language that doesn't feel authentic to her. Louise had a way of working with words that I truly admired. She seemed often to be trying out a word or tasting its effects as though they were part of a favorite recipe. You've heard a lot about that. She had an extremely physical experience with language, and during our conversations, she used to repeat phrases and ideas, and often asked me about Italian words, just so she could be sure to pronounce them adequately, not necessarily accurately, or think more about their etymologies. More important, Louise was unafraid to discuss any of the many difficult, psychologically devastating topics she skillfully engaged in her work and during her life, including some similar experiences we share, and that she was committed to understanding as fully as possible, maybe more fully than I ever was. I first met Louise in 1996 when I was still a practicing social worker in New York City, working in aid services and foster care planning. I had been invited to give my first public reading right around the corner here at Barnes & Noble in Astor Place. It was June. I remember exactly because the reading was introduced as a gay pride event, unbeknownst to me. And this revelation pretty much shocked and unnerved me. Louise was sitting with Edvige Giunta right in the middle of the audience, both in my direct sight line, and the two of them were beacons of a knowing and smiling intensity. I read early versions of several of my own sexual abuse and incest poems that would become part of a book, and now I was feeling vulnerable. After the reading, they both came up to me and introduced themselves, and I sloughed off the gay pride connection by claiming, oh, I don't know nothing about this gay pride stuff, as a joke, of course. And Louise commented how funny and disarming that seemed to her, giving the material. But both Eddie and Louise, these two well-known professors, offered such solace and recognition of the work's value. I instantly fell in love with both of them. And, I'm a little overbearing, so if I fall in love with you, I call you, I text you. Louise thanked me for being brave and encouraged me to understand how the humor could deflect and also reinforce the impact of the ideas. And just a little bit off script here, one of my favorite images in Vertigo is when Louise throws the rocks at the ducks. You know, I just think that's so funny, and screams at them and curses, and something that we would all do, but maybe not admit. So this friendship has lasted all these years. And I've heard a lot about Louise through Eddie when she felt she could share some things. And like many of us, I was always a little bit afraid of Louise's intensity, even as I worked through some of her direct and complex lessons. She was incredibly straightforward, and she wanted that kind of engagement back. And I was mostly happy to oblige, but not always. During one of my last conversations with her in September 2018, just before she died, she asked, as she always does, how my work was going and how I was feeling and how my mother was doing. Even as Louise struggled with the end stages of her cancer that she kept relatively hidden from most people, she was selfless and asking others and in offering incisive advice. And about my own mother, she said, you know, don't listen to your family. Your mother's 93. She has a broken hip. She needs to be in a nursing home. You know, my mother's still alive, almost 95. It was Louise's way. She didn't want to talk about her health, her legacy, you know, nothing. I think she listened anyway, and I'm honored to help preserve part of this legacy. And I just want to end with a few collage sections from The House of Early Sorrows, just 3 short excerpts. The first piece is from the prologue, where she talks about working class writing and says, all a memoirist of people who led obscure lives can do, all I can do is try to imagine their lives from the few shreds of evidence left behind to represent them, to re-present them to readers, to accord them a little gift of time, remembrance, respect, and yes, to try to ensure that their lives and deaths are not erased, or not erased, I'm sorry, I fudged that a little, but from another essay, Lifeboat, about her father forcing her to swim 2 miles across Lake George, she offers this. Typical Navy bullshit, not insisting you have to know what you need to know to survive. Better, my father said, to die alone than to be dragged to the bottom of the ocean by someone clawing at you because he was too lazy or too stupid to learn what he should know to take care of himself. And finally, I want to end with the last paragraph of White on Black, an essay that also appeared in the anthology Embroidered Stories, interpreting women's domestic needlework from the Italian diaspora. Gives you a sense of what she did with the cover of The House of Early Sorrows. The piece is obviously a metaphor for writing and revising, and it's about how the most humble and significant intensities often go unrecognized. I'm thrilled that we're able to recognize the power and the luminous beauty of Louise's writing, and that we can celebrate the paperback release of this important scholarly volume of her work. And let me leave you with Louise's words. This is about her grandmother. Once I saw my grandmother finish a tablecloth and begin a new one on the same day without stopping to admire what she had accomplished, without holding it up to the light of the window admiringly. To crochet and to knit in the absence of anyone's desire but your own. To crochet and to knit because the very act of knitting, the very act of crocheting, gives what others do not, what others cannot give you, what this country that you came to does not give you, a sense of worth and some small scrap of human dignity. Thank you.
Hi, My name is Amy Jo Burns, and I want to say thank you to Eddie and Nancy and to NYU for having me. I'm deeply honored to be a voice here who gets to share with you about the life and the work of Louise DeSalvo, a writer who remains the premier heart and mind of contemporary memoir. Like some others here tonight, I was her MFA graduate student in memoir from 2009 to 2011, and then I worked as her research assistant for a few years after that. So I had the opportunity to witness her work as a teacher, a researcher, a scholar, and a writer. At that time, she was working on material that would form her three most recent books, which include Chasing Ghosts, The House of Early Sorrows, and her craft book, The Art of Slow Writing. It's this last book that I think came as a bit of a surprise to her because it was born out of a blog she kept during that time period, a blog which she titled Writing a Life. The essay that I wrote for Personal Effects focuses on the blog, which is a word that I hate because the stereotypical implication of a word like blog is that it's not an art form and there's no craft to it, right? But in typical Louise DeSalvo fashion, she took that stereotype and delightfully subverted it. The blog she kept from about 2010 to 2013 is a document that also serves as an artistic artifact of a writer who captured what it's like to be in the process of writing a memoir. I'd like to briefly share two reasons why that combination is such a critical addition to the conversation of memoir as a distinctly essential literary genre. The first is that during a time when memoir was largely described as fiction but true, as a way to legitimize the form, DeSalvo was the expert who heralded memoir as a discrete genre with its own purposes and techniques, fully separate from those of fiction. As a professor, she dedicated an entire semester to the hallmarks of memoir, many of which make appearances in Writing a Life. They include how a memoirist travels through time, how she employs reflection and image patterns, as well as how she prioritizes backstory. DeSalvo proved to her students and her readership that memoir has always deserved to be its own literary genre, regardless of what the loudest, often male voices of our literary culture are declaring. Memoir is on the front lines of history, she often said. Do I want to read about a war from a distant historian, she asked, or from someone who fought in the trenches? The second reason why DeSalvo's voice will continue to be essential to discussions about memoir as a cultural and artistic footprint is that she was a writer who modeled for her students what she taught as she was teaching. The blog itself was born from conversations she had with us in her office, in her classroom, or over lunch. That's why the entries managed to feel both personal and universal. In each class she taught, DeSalvo would talk through what she worked on earlier that day in her writing session, and her students got to witness a professional writer take a set of pages from draft form to final product. Often these discussions would end up in her blog later that week. She had an incredible gift for one-liners, which is why her classroom notes transferred so easily to her blog format. And I thought I'd share just a few of my favorites. Memoir recounts not the facts of a life, but the experience of a life. Don't ignore the power of using a single word. Pay attention to the seemingly insignificant. Say yes to much and no to more. Getting through a hard time often entails experiencing it and watching yourself experience it. I'm talking a lot about the act of witnessing tonight because for DeSalvo, that was essential to the way a memoirist works that is separate from the way a novelist works. A memoirist must witness her own life, and she must choose how her readers will witness it as well. What's wholly unique and necessary about these daily reflections she gave in Writing a Life is that you can watch DeSalvo capture her artistic process as she's doing it without the benefit of retrospection. This means she didn't know at the time how those memoirs would turn out, which ultimately highlights the importance of writing as a process rather than a product. As I said, much of this material ended up in her craft book, The Art of Slow Writing, but the other half of it is particular to memoir itself, and that material is a master class in how to craft a memoir, written in very digestible daily forms. Louise's impact continues to be absolutely vital, not only because of what she said about memoir, but how she said it. I don't think mass communication was ever her priority. Everything was done individually or in small groups over a meal. What she taught to one student and one young writer has been passed to the next and the next and the next, and that is her living legacy. To give you a brief example, one of the last email exchanges she and I had was about the economics behind hiring a babysitter to watch my kids while I wrote. I was having trouble figuring out a dollar amount that was worth investing in myself, and she shared with me that her writing had paid for her son's college tuition after being saved over time, but that she was only able to do that because she afforded herself the time to work. She was always so lovingly practical about the logistics of a life in art, and that's exactly what is so badly needed in contemporary MFA curriculum. To close, I want to share what she told me then that I still repeat to myself now when I sit down at my desk while a babysitter is caring for my children. She wrote, "Just keep remembering that writing is work. Say, I'm working, not I'm writing, and the gravitas of what you're doing will be apparent to you." Thank you.
Good evening. I'm John Gennari. I'm Emily Bernard's husband. Many thanks to Eddie and Nancy and Nancy and Fordham and everybody, and a great honor to sit on this the stage with these folks. I think I'm probably the person who knew Louise the least of the folks that you've heard from so far. My in the flesh interaction with her, I think, was limited to 2 or 3 occasions at Eddie and Josh's house. It was around the table. The discussion was about food and writing, of course. But she is the writer that I feel closest to. And she is the writer who I think has helped me, as a writer, feel closer to myself. And I'll try to explain why that is. And I'll start by just reiterating something Emily said, which is that very early in our relationship, we met in 1998. We got married in 2001. I think it was during 2001 that I look over in the bed to see what Emily's reading, and it's this book called Adultery. This was my introduction to Louise DeSalvo, and
Imagine when you see your mom writing it.
there you go. And it was very shortly thereafter that Emily gave me a copy of Vertigo, and I read it and was blown away. And I will read something actually from Emily's essay in Personal Effects that talks about this. Emily's telling the story of my reading Vertigo and coming to her to read to her a paragraph that just hit me very, very hard. So I'm quoting Louise from Vertigo. "I come from a family, from a cultural heritage where women don't go away to do things separately from men. That is not to say that men don't go away to do things separately from women. They do, and often. But in the land of my forebears, women sit around and wait for their men, or they make a sumptuous meal and they work very hard and watch their children and wait for their men. But they don't go anywhere without their men, or do anything for themselves alone without their men, except complain to their children or to anyone else who will listen to them about their men and about their bad luck in having been born female. Vertigo, page 220. Now, quoting Emily, John came upon these words in Vertigo, DeSalvo's 1996 memoir. I had just told him that I wanted to go away for a week-long writer's workshop. Initially, he hadn't understood why I wanted to go. He had always supported my writing, all of my writing. Why did I want to leave our home? Why did I seem so desperate to leave him behind? Sometimes when we go to visit John's parents for the holidays, his family sits in a circle while John reads aloud. Whether he's reading a passage from his own writing or an article in the newspaper, it doesn't matter. When John, the oldest son, reads, it is an occasion. Be quiet, Johnny's reading, announces his mother. The rest of us comply and shut up. So who is this mother of mine? I was asked by Eddie, as were several others in the room, to contribute to an Italian-American review, a celebration, memorialization of Louise and her work. I was given 500 words. Some others seem to have gotten a little more space, but I'll leave that behind. My contribution is called Nasty Woman, and I open by likening Louise to Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, two other ethnic American badass women. And I say, because we've now begun to refer iconically to Ginsburg as RBG and Ocasio-Cortez as AOC, I'll henceforth refer to DeSalvo as LDS and call on all woke people to do the same. And what I do here is to connect Louise to my mother. And I say that my mother was the founder of what I'm calling the Bergen County, New Jersey Badass Women Association. My mother's reign of badassness in Fairview and Cliffside Park came a generation before LDS's in Richfield and Teaneck. My mother was no woman of letters, not just in the exalted scholarly sense. I doubt she wrote 10 personal letters her whole life, none at all to me. Typical of young women in her neighborhood, Clara, my mother's name is Clara del Cortivo Gennari. She left school at 15 to work as a seamstress in a North Bergen garment factory. She was a tomboy, much feared in the parks and streets. One oft-told family story is of the time she hunted down a young punk known locally as Tony Baloney, who'd made fun of my Aunt Angie's chronic limp or picked on my Uncle Abby. I've heard it told both ways. Finding and corralling Tony, young Clara pummeled him ear to ear, pinned him to the ground, and, the canonical coup de grace, squeezed the juice of an orange into his eyes. One finds in LDS's memoirs many instances of a propensity for, a need of, physical entanglement. The forms of bodily encounter range from sex to knife play, but much of it takes place through food. Cooking and eating as the intimate congress of bodies, the kitchen as mosh pit of desire and discord. Just as RBG's and AOC's public images linger on bodily detail, octogenarian RBG in the gym, AOC dancing as a college student. You know what I'm talking about, the media stuff about them. LDS's badassness was a matter of asserting the primacy of the body and its true feeling in a space, academia, where sensuality, touch, taste, smell, sound, and emotional honesty are routinely distrusted and suppressed. Every true and vital sentence I write, every curse I utter at yet another underseasoned campus Sodexo luncheon or department potluck, every righteous political passion I act on, all channel LDS and Clara del Cortivo Gennari and their northern New Jersey badassness. Together, these kindred spirits are the astringent citrus fierceness that toughen and clarify my vision.
You know, I've gone after John Gennari before, and I think it's so unfair every time. What can I say? I'm Nancy Carnevale, and actually I'm here in my capacity as co-editor of the Critical Studies in Italian America series at Fordham, which I edit with Laura Roberto. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, just a few words about the series itself. We publish works on the history and culture of Italian Americans by emerging as well as established scholars in a variety of fields. And I'll just mention a few: anthropology, cultural studies, folklore, history, literary studies, media studies. The focus is on the United States, but we also look for comparative studies with other parts of the Italian diaspora. And although the content of our publications is specific to Italian Americans, we're interested in work that engages with broader questions of identity that are relevant to the larger fields of ethnic studies, gender studies, migration studies, and such. When Eddie and Nancy first approached us about publishing personal effects in the series, we didn't hesitate. We knew the importance of Louise DeSalvo, and we also knew that her multidimensional body of work had not received the attention that it deserves. DeSalvo worked in many genres. It's difficult, really, to do justice to her imprint on the Italian American and the wider American literary and scholarly scenes, from her path-breaking work as a Virginia Woolf scholar to her memoir writing. Virginia Woolf, The Impact of Childhood Sexual Abuse on Her Life and Work, published in 1989, was named one of the most important books of the 20th century by Women's Review of Books. She turned to memoir with her award-winning Vertigo in 1996, and through that seminal work, along with the many memoirs that followed, DeSalvo helped to shape a still burgeoning genre. All this as an Italian-American woman writer in an era when Italian-American literary production overall was largely ignored. Her life's work was, of course, even more varied than that suggested. As the Jenny Hunter Endowed Scholar for Creative Writing and Literature at Hunter College, in addition to being a Virginia Woolf scholar, she positioned herself as a literary critic and biographer, publishing on Hawthorne, on D.H. Lawrence, young adult literature, and more. She was a novelist, as well as a memoirist, a personal essayist, a committed feminist, and of course, a teacher of writing. Her creative and scholarly work was, to a great extent, built on and through her experiences as an Italian-American woman of working-class origins. She wrote with great awareness of her ethnicity and class positioning. In memoirs like Vertigo and Crazy in the Kitchen, she deconstructs the Italian immigrant ethnic experience, rejecting the romantic success story that she herself embodied as the working-class Italian kid from Hoboken who became a literary scholar and a college professor, instead to explore the dark side of assimilation. Rather than romanticize cultural norms through the lens of nostalgia, she analyzed the sources of those norms without ignoring or denying their power. As she wrote in the prologue of The House of Early Sorrows, quote, "I came to believe this form of memoir that honors our forebears by reimagining their lives but without romanticizing them is especially necessary during a time when ordinary people are being robbed of their ability to lead a dignified life, when their past stands in danger of being erased, when in a nation of supposed promise the future is bleak for those, like my forebears, who work hard and long, yet try to continue against all obstacles to hope, to dream." Her work, however, as we've heard, was not bound by her ethnicity. She brought her lucid prose to bear on subjects as varied as environmental degradation and related illness, moving, and more. Her books on writing, Writing as a Way of Healing, and The Art of Slow Writing, I would say are among the best in this genre. And I did want to also share something from Writing a Life's blog, which I found, again, we've heard this word a lot tonight, just such an incredible act of generosity putting together that blog. It was really a perfect additional manifestation of DeSalvo's legendary mentoring. And as an example of that generosity, in one of those posts entitled Writing Community, she argued for a 1970s era feminist approach to writing as what she called a cooperative endeavor. Rather than compete with each other, she emphasized how writers benefit from the support of other writers who read, edit, review, and publish the work of their peers. She asked her readers to be generous to other writers, not only to advance individual careers, but because such an approach advances the group as a whole, and these are her words, so that the members of the entire community can move into a more important place in the culture. We're really honored to have Personal Effects on our list, knowing that it will illuminate the life and work of Louise DeSalvo for students, scholars, and writers today and in the years to come. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I just want to say thank you all for coming. Thank you to Edvige, as always, for this. And thank you to all of you. It's really nice to see all of you. And I also want to give props to Angel, who gave us that fabulous cover. He's here tonight, so let's give him some props. So I'm going to make some remarks and probably intersperse some of what these folks said so brilliantly tonight. But I want to start with something that I wrote. About 20 years ago, I met an art historian who told me he worked on 19th century art and architecture since he had a hard time with contemporary artists. He said, live artists want to tell you how to talk about their work. They want to control what's said about what they do. Artists who are dead can't do that. I like it better. I can say and do what I want. As a writer at the time, I found his words arrogant and self-serving. As Louise would say, he was an asshole. But he was also an academic asshole. I was not and had no plans to become one. Fast forward 10 years, I'm entering a PhD program and find myself standing next to Edvige Giunta at what was then the Italian American Historical Association annual conference being held that year in Connecticut. I'd been perusing the program, and it was filled with panels on Mario Puzo, mafiosi, and men. I felt frustrated. The panels about and with women did not feel part of the main conference. In my experience, the men hardly ever attended the panels about or featuring women writers. I knew Italian-American women writers like Louise, Diane DePrima, Maria Mazziati-Gillen. I knew and had read work by Italian-American women scholars and researchers like Helen Barolini, Mary Jo Bona, Edvige Giunta, Josephine Hendin, and Sandra Mortola-Gilbert. But Italian-American women writers and scholars still felt like a supplement rather than the main attraction. I turned to Edvige casually and I said, I think we should do a panel on Louise's work at next year's conference. I thought I was being radical. I thought I was demanding space to engage intellectually and critically with a writer who had done some important things, as Louise might say. I momentarily forgot all of the work that was being done by the women I've just mentioned. Without missing a beat, Edvige responded, yes, and then we can do the book. At that point, I think I smiled and said, of course. But inside, I panicked. I thought I had misunderstood her, that she didn't understand me. But she understood, and I hadn't misheard. To this day, as so many of these folks have mentioned, Louise DeSalvo is the most ubiquitous and expansive writer among us. She left us with 21 published volumes about her first subject, Virginia Woolf, memoirs about her father's PTSD through World War II, her mother's and sister's depression, her sister's suicide, her life growing up in an immigrant enclave in Hoboken, New Jersey, essays about asthma, about adultery and moving, books about how to write during hard times and developing writing processes, anthologies that included women writers she wished she had been able to read as a young person thinking about how to become a writer. A novel about a woman's sexuality with no male gaze in attendance. This output would normally force a consideration of a man's work at the rate of at least one book every 3 years. And yet, Personal Effects is the first volume about her work. It was actually the first volume about an Italian-American woman's work, a solo book. When Eddie and I worked on Personal Effects, instead of someone who wanted to control her story, as my art historian academic complained would happen, I encountered an artist who was generous and a bit awestruck that Eddie and I wanted to treat her work with the same respect and introspection that DeLillo's or Puzzos is paid. She made clear she would steer clear of asking us about our progress or telling us what to do. Instead, when we asked, she shared her process, the way a researcher, a writer thinks and works through the long preparation before a book becomes a newborn baby in the world. In those 5 years from germination to publication, Eddie and I sat in the whirlwind, gathering together scholars, writers, and researchers we thought could speak aloud and to Louise's work, then asking folks to contribute to the volume, and then the hard and sometimes tedious work of editing and putting a volume together that would do Louise's work justice. I dove in because I didn't know any better. I trusted Eddie as a co-editor. I trusted the importance of Louise's work. And we were fortunate to have these beautiful, incisive collaborators and the support of Fordham University Press, and most especially Nancy Carnevale and Laura Roberto, editors of the Italian-American series. Tonight, you've heard from people who love Louise. Some considered her a friend, a mom, a mentor, an ideal reader. For me, my relationship with Louise began differently. She was my subject first and foremost. And I learned that because of the way she treated Virginia Woolf, right? I found her kind, patient, and forthcoming. If something were private, she let us know, but she readily went into her journals and notebooks to provide details we needed for a section or a paragraph in our introduction, or to clarify one of our contributors' chapters. She took us to lunch, because there's always food, to support us, and she loved sharing amazing meals. I went to some beautiful restaurants with her, and it was never to police what we were doing. I learned that Louise was generous in all aspects of her life, her writing work, her research work, her teaching work, and her home life. Last year, 60 months ago, when she passed away, I was so envious of folks who talked about the ubiquitous and ongoing correspondence they all had with her. And I've only recently discovered how much of an active email correspondence we had over a 10-year period. In the past month, in preparation for this celebration, I started reading what she wrote. I believe this opening is connected somehow to my mother's death 5 months and 1 week ago today. I've been dropped into a space that I do not know, and I cannot see the edges of. There are days I feel that I've lost my words. I'm sorry. And days when I think I've not done enough. But reading through my email chain and with Louise reminds me of the generosity that Louise had for other writers, no matter where in the process they were or what turn their work took. I'm still not ready to share directly what we wrote, but in reading this correspondence, I remembered the night Eddie and I sent our introductory essay for personal effects to Louise. I'd come to New Jersey for one of our work weekends, and we were in Eddie's writing space, a space that Josh actually built for her. So I always felt like it was my space for a little while when I was there. We read through the introduction one more time, because we always had to read through things one more time, created an email, attached the document for Louise to read, and Eddie hit the send button. Then we waited. We may have giggled. We definitely giggled. We knew we were close to being finished. We needed Louise to fact check what we'd written, but it was actually the first time she was reading any of what the book was and became. I thought about the art historian, and I thought, oh, here it comes. We've done it all wrong. But no. Louise responded with a phone call to thank us. She said she didn't recognize herself. She was so moved by the expansiveness of the way we saw her work, the way we saw her place as an Italian-American woman writer, a Woolf scholar, a novelist turned memoirist. Then she sent an email thanking us again and filling in some points that needed clarification. She went back to her notebooks to confirm timelines, a fact here, a story there. When we birthed Personal Effects, I did not think what would come next. Tonight, I turn to Eddie and I say, look, our baby's all grown up and is a paperback now. I wish that I could thank Louise one more time, but I know that whatever I would say would be inadequate. I feel a sense of urgency being here as I even write this and talk with all of you. Women's spaces continue to be precarious. Louise's determination kept her working as she established herself as a Woolf scholar in the 1970s and 80s, actually helping to establish Woolf in the women's studies field. Her turn to memoir in the 90s at the beginning of what would today be considered an important field of study, and as Amy Jo Burns has pointed out, it's so imperative that we understand her central place. Her work as a professor of memoir writing when most creative writing departments focused only on poetry and fiction was radical. When others marginalized her work, when others found it too daring or risky, she continued on. No matter the circumstance, she persisted. While those in the future will only know her the way my art historian friend feels comfortable understanding his subject from a distance, I am so grateful that I was able to have a close view of the way that Louise worked and lived her life. And I thank all of you. And I'm so grateful.
I don't need to tell you that we will do a symposium on Louise DeSalvo in the not so distant future. And I want to thank, first of all, our presenters and also all of you for listening. And I want to give an opportunity to our audience to ask questions or if there are, I know there are some former students of Louise in the audience. We would love just for you to be part of this conversation. And I cannot see people well in the light.
Thank you, everybody. It was such a wonderful, an opportunity to celebrate Louise DeSalvo. I was so saddened to hear about her transitioning. And one thing that comes to mind is she's our brilliant friend.
My name is Francesca Elms, and I'm from Montclair. And one of the acts of great generosity that Louise DeSalvo did was to run a book discussion group at the Watchung Booksellers on memoir. She did it for many years and was so inspiring, and it was so clear that some of the days were tricky for her. But she was so amazingly generous, and she would start out every session saying, "This is not a class. I'm not your professor. I'm facilitating. And then she would throw out all of her pearls of wisdom, and some of us were rapidly jotting them down because she couldn't help but share so many wonderful ideas about writing, and she was just lovely. And we were very lucky to have her. And this was after, I believe, she had to give up teaching, but she couldn't give up teaching. She was still there for us.
Yes.
So you should take away how much joy that gave her. Giving up teaching was brutally hard for her. Facing that she was losing her energy and that she had to do less as the Spitfire that she was, that was not something that she took easily. And those days when she would meet with you, she would have a little extra spring in her step. It really meant a lot to her. And when she finally had to even stop doing that, that was, I remember, one of the hardest days in her decline. I remember we had dinner when she had made the decision that she was not going to be able to do that anymore, and she was crestfallen. And so you did a good thing for her, too. You did a mitzvah. So, yeah.
May I say something that I feel like I want to just emphasize? Never a cliche. And as a student of Louise's writing, never an easy turn, never laziness. And that is, for me, the model of fierceness, precision, made sure every metaphor hit. You know, so I just had to say that.
I'm Annie Lanzolato, and one thing that's impressing me tonight is how writers, we help each other learn how to live. I've learned a lot about how to live from people here and from people here. Joanna Claps Herman told me what deodorant to use. It's a deodorant you can't find in a store. It will never give you a rash. And I was in Whole Foods buying expensive deodorants. I said to my doctor, they were all burning out of, my doctor said, I don't care where you buy it, that it's all natural. If you feel an irritation, get rid of it. But a doctor didn't solve that problem, Joanna did. Josh recently taught me how not to flip a frittata, but slide it on the top of a pan, which no one in the world could do because it's so slippery. John taught me how to stretch. We were both baseball players, like me and Pele were third base, catcher. What was your position?
Pitcher and third base.
Okay, so we got bad knees. John has a routine on how to, stretch the hip joints and knees. Eddie's taught me so much, I don't know where to begin. Mostly it's the Sicilian rules of all the things I do wrong. that I'll never be forgiven, apparently. So. Emily taught me how to, this is another bedroom story. How to take time and relax in bed and have poetry on the walls that you referred to. This is Elizabeth's bedroom that we were in. We were in another poet's bedroom together. But the poems were framed, one poem 3 feet in a big frame. There must have been 30 of them. And we'd refer to them. You just taught me something. I don't know you. Yeah, you taught me something. But I don't remember what it is. But when you were speaking... Now, Louise, Phyllis taught me to chalk for the triangle and to become part of that movement. Stan's taught me so much about Naples, and But I don't mean, no, that's not right. Like when I was locked in quarantine in Sloan Kettering, what did I think about what you taught me? How the prigionieri scratch their messages in the walls, the rabbit. Watch out for the rabbit, who was the fascist traitor hiding amongst the movement. Louise taught me how to breathe. One Christmas Eve, for some reason, when I was alienated from family, who knows why, Eddie took me to Louise's house, Eddie and Josh. And I brought some presents for one of your kids. Was it your kid? The best present that I remember as a kid were the big oversized sunglasses. You remember those? Pele. So Louise, maybe she heard my wheeze. If you hear me cough tonight, it's not a cough. It's that the cilia is damaged from radiation, so I have to cough to compensate. I walk in Louise's house, and there's huge air purifiers, big, industrial. And then the kitchen cookbooks are all clean and organized. I never saw anyone have books in the kitchen without creating dust. An asthmatic can't have books in the kitchen. Louise taught me, you can't go for a walk 9 a.m., you're asthmatic. 9 a.m. is a high emission time. You have to get up before the cars to walk, or wait till that period's over and go 1 o'clock. Your mother taught me how to breathe, because when you walk around the world, you can't breathe. And you can't distill, like in this coronavirus, legitimate series of rules. What are the rules for breathing? She wrote the book. She gave me that book that Christmas Eve. There's rules in there. What are the emission times? When are the busy streets? You can't wait for a bus. You can't wait for a bus. You wait for a bus, you can't breathe. Louise's house, you could breathe. But this was an act of self-esteem that two asthmatic, working-class daughters of Pacific War veterans who were in those jungle battles, of course we couldn't breathe. Who could breathe?
Am I good? I can't hear. I'm the little guy. That's Jason, my big brother. I want to share with you guys, most of you are here because Louise affected your life somehow. She was a powerful teacher, a powerful mom, and I'm continuing the spirit of teaching with my wife at the Karate School in Montclair. And one of the things that hit me at a young age from my mom was that there is no separation between your calling and your work and the time that you're supposed to devote to that, except, of course, if it was mealtime. Then all work got stopped. The books got put down. The pieces started going in the oven. And so mealtime in the house was very sacrosanct. But my mom was a living mirror of what she wanted her students, and I think me and Jason to pick up, was that you don't need to define how much you work or what you focus on in life is, but you have to find the right balance so that one doesn't eat the other, because a personal life can affect your stature as a teacher. You can't connect to students if you're always worrying about home. But on the flip side, if you're all about your work, that's not a life to live either. Home is where the balance is. Home is where you feel your work is valued. You share your books with your family first. You know, you talk about what you're going to teach in the class first with your loved ones at the table. And I think that the balance was something that I found later in life. And it wasn't until I learned that from my mom that I could balance my deafness with my teaching, with how hard it is to be a karate instructor for special needs kids. that are autistic, Asperger's, deaf like me, and working 5 and 6, 7 days a week. Like my mom, I was trying to have that same work ethic. But for me, my lucky number was 3 and 4 days a week. And, you know, more like, I think I'm more like my dad, like Sicilian. But I find that in those 3 and 4 days, I'm like my mom. I'm super productive. I get probably 2 weeks to work done in those 4 days because I have her work ethic and I am balanced. So I think the best thing that we can take from my mom's life is not only what she detailed in planning, and her planner, my wife's planner, probably match it identically. It's the reason I'm married to you, because of that aspect of being able to fit every aspect of life. But really, the planner was so that she wouldn't forget the family balance. She wouldn't forget the balance with students. She wouldn't forget the balance with teaching. She wouldn't forget the balance with writing. But if you're out of balance, nothing makes sense. It's not worth it. So let's go with being balanced. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you. Can we have a round of applause for Louise's children? Because of how they were, you guys, as a mother, I'm just so impressed by the love and support and the room you gave your mother to write the way she needed to write. And also your dad. Because what I got from adultery was frankly a very strong marriage. Because I remember the moment Louise wrote, and your dad said, why do you have to keep writing about this? And then he said, I know why you have to keep writing about this. And I thought, that's what I want. A husband who understands I have to do what I have to do, I have to tell the truth I have to tell. So thank you both for making it possible.
You're welcome.
Well, I think we've come to the close of our evening. We have books upstairs. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our presenter. Thank you to Louise's family. They are incredible. I don't want to even say allies because they're really the leaders in keeping Louise's legacy alive and finding ways of celebrating it and carrying it on. And I look forward to seeing all of you at the future Louise DeSalvo Symposium.
Can I make one more shameless plug? If you already have all the books that are upstairs, like I do, multiple copies of them, buy one and give it to a friend. And I mean it, because the way we pass on her legacy, I've given my mom's books to people and they're blown away. They're like, I had no idea that she was that prolific or that talented or that her books spoke on so many levels. So if you already have everything up there, don't just walk by the table, pick up a copy and give it to a friend, because you'll change their life. So, anyway.
Jason, can I just ask a question about some of the other work that she has, the diaries and work that's not published, and what's happening with that? Can we?
So, actually,
tell a lot of the writers to.
yeah.
It's kind of, everything is still in the works and conversation, so I don't think we want to talk about the designated library until that has been.
But it is going to be somewhere.
It's going to be somewhere, definitely. Louise left a very large, first of all, the level of organization of her work, and she left over 100 volumes of journals. But we will definitely, they will find that there will be a great home, there will be a Louise DeSalvo archive, and it just takes some time because there is a lot of details that have to be defined, and in time.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, we will definitely make sure that it is safe, it's archived, and it's accessible. So, yeah. Thanks all for coming.